So as we've seen, in terms of positionality, we are connected to the world that we study, and our research encounters influence the type of knowledge we construct. So if we want to construct knowledge beyond numbers, beyond yes, no, or other short answers, and we want knowledge that outlines insight into the experience and motivations that we have about the world, then we need to use any form of qualitative method. If we want a method, though, that goes beyond numbers and statistics and deeper into what people say they do, how people say they feel, and how people articulate in words the meanings, ideas, thoughts, practices that make up their worlds, for this, interviews are a key methodology to use. As Ackroyd and Hughes define, interviews are encounters between a researcher and a respondent, in which the latter is asked a series of questions relevant to the subject of research. In many senses, therefore, interviews are a variation on the normal interactions we have between people. They're dialogues that transfer knowledge and information, predominantly through verbal exchange. Interviews can range from a systematic interrogation akin to a cross-examination by authorities, through to informal conversations with a purpose. In whatever form they take, interviews seek to discern the experiences, the thoughts and feelings of those we're studying. Interviews are therefore primarily used to access what people say about their lives. They're useful in finding out how people interpret their own worlds, the meanings they give to their lives, either through reasoned analysis or through more or less coherent ramblings. Interviews are self-reports of experiences, opinions and feelings, and the success of this method relies not only on the individual's ability to comment on their own world, but also the interviewer's ability to ask the right questions to access this knowledge. Interviews can thus be understood as conversations with a purpose. In contrast to surveys, interviews are sensitive and people-orientated. They allow interviewees to construct their own accounts of their own experiences by describing and explaining their lives in their own words. As a consequence, they allow the researcher and the interviewee to have a far more wide-ranging discussion than a survey or a questionnaire would allow. The interview allows respondents to raise issues that neither might have anticipated before the interview began or was found through preliminary research. And as a consequence, the material generated is rich, detailed and multi-layered in nature. So before we begin an interview, it's important that the researcher enjoys a degree of literacy on the topic under investigation. Although this may seem counterintuitive, you're asking questions of someone else because you don't know about their culture, background literacy is nevertheless vital, so questions are not formulated that may prove embarrassing to ourselves or the respondent, waste anybody's time. For example, are we asking the right questions to the right person? Do we need to actually ask questions through an interview, or can that information be found through a website or another data source, for example? So from this background literacy, a range of themes can be generated to use in our interview. These themes can be employed in a number of ways. You may wish, for example, to fashion a range of specific questions to guide the interview from a beginning to a middle through to its end. This would be a structured format of an interview and is often useful for those who may be inexperienced or nervous about conducting interviews, and it provides for us a path to follow throughout the conversation's duration. This format is also useful if multiple interviews are going to be carried out and the results systematically compared in perhaps a style similar to a mass-produced survey. In many cases, however, the structured format precludes the realisation of the greatest strengths of the interview method, the opportunity to build rapport between the researcher and the respondent, and the discovery of the unexpected through this improvised conversation. For example, we may follow up a new line of inquiry that's only produced through our conversation. In order to realise these benefits, it's often the case that a more semi-structured approach is adopted to undertaking the interview. So semi-structured interviews use the general themes obtained through background literacy to identify key questions or areas that the interviewer wishes to cover. From this, only a small number of questions will be asked in a strictly chronological order, perhaps questions that seek to establish rapport or open conversation between the interviewer and the interviewee. From these, the questioner follows the responses in a more improvised way, endeavouring to gain all the information sought, but not necessarily in the order envisaged at the outset. In this way, semi-structured interviews allow the potential for a much broader discussion to occur than the researcher may have originally anticipated, with new ideas and avenues for exploration being discovered along the way. It also gives the interviewer the opportunity to jettison questions as they prove redundant or inappropriate. The semi-structured approach therefore requires a degree of confidence on the part of the interviewer, but through establishing rapport through conversation, this format often results in rich and highly detailed accounts of individuals' experiences and their lives. The third major variety of research interview is the unstructured interview. These dialogues have a general aim, perhaps to talk about a life history of a person, a general campaign or a culture, but have no specific questions and are fully improvisational. These interviews are often selected when the interviewer and interviewee already enjoy a degree of rapport with one another, so that trust and conversation are easily generated in the first place and maintained throughout the interview. So people who are very confident or perhaps experienced or literate at interviewing often equip themselves with just a list of themes, like in a semi or an unstructured interview. Personally, I like to be prepared with actual questions in case the conversation dries up. I would recommend to devise a series of actual questions linked to some general prompts that you can use to generate conversation. So researchers often start with a question that participants are likely to feel comfortable answering. This also allows both parties' confidence to be built and retain a greater degree of control over proceedings. More difficult, sensitive or thought-provoking questions are best left to the second half of the interview, when participants are perhaps feeling a little bit more comfortable and are happy to talk in more detail. Also, I would not necessarily ask questions in the order listed. Allowing the discussion to unfold in a conversational manner often offers participants the chance to explore issues they feel are important whatever time. At the end of the interview, however, I would also check my schedule to make sure all the questions have been covered at some stage or another during the interview. So whatever form we use, the structured, semi or unstructured interview, interviews generate detailed, rich and textured insight into the social world. They can be tailored to take into account the positioning of individuals concerned and thus make it possible for them to use their own words to give experiences to their own accounts. These accounts depend on a good rapport being established between researcher and respondent, the use of appropriate questions, but also the choice of an appropriate location for an interview, as we'll look into in more detail in a later podcast. So the potential of interviews can be sensitive sometimes to the geographical context in which they're conducted, but context also needs to be taken into account in terms of the type of responses that are given. In the first instance, this involves listening. So although interviews directly involve asking questions, their potential is only realised if answers are produced. So listening to responses and judging their meaning are key to conducting an effective interview. Are responses, for example, ironic or satirical, or are they being deadly serious? Being sensitive to the responses allows the interviewer to judge what type of question might be appropriate in follow-up to this exchange. Does the response require clarification? Does it suggest another question? Or does it say it all? The context of responses may be clear also when the research is undertaken, but may be lost when we study our interviews later on. So how are we going to make sure that context is taken into account through our interviews? Are we going to make handwritten notes? Are we going to audio record our interviews? Or perhaps we're even going to film them? These issues are not only vital for one-to-one interviews, but also for group interviews or focus groups. And that's what we're going to turn to in the next podcast.